going to introduce our next speaker, but I wanted to mention also in relationship to the PowerPoints that we did see, which were excellent, was the idea that of creating arguments that are ethical and moral arguments that this right to water is the right given to us by the Creator. And naturally, we're coming into the indigenous portion of our meeting here, but it is an argument that only is going to come from this group as they meet with these corporate leaders. And we need to develop those skills in making those arguments also. And maybe we should be talking about the corporate right to water and not the human right. That should be already understood. In 2005, we got involved with the African American community and the Onondaga leadership in Jersey City for a press conference that was dealing with Ally Signal, who had polluted both areas. Allied Signal had given land to the city of New Jersey, who sold it to the black community for an outrageous amount of money. What had developed after a number of years was that huge numbers of African Americans were coming down with cancer. Green stuff was bubbling up from the cellars in their houses. It turned out that the land that the Ally Signal had given to the city was polluted, heavily polluted. Ally Signal was soon bought by Honeywell. In the joint, and you're going to hear from our guest speaker today, talking about what Ally Signal and Honeywell has done to Onondaga Lake. And these two communities came together in a press conference, which we were present at, to let the communities know about these two companies. In the following years, many of you relinquished proxies to the annual shareholder meeting where indigenous leaders were given the opportunity to address Honeywell on these issues. Today we have Joe Heath, who's the attorney for the Onondaga Nation. And interesting enough, maybe for some of you, Joe has successfully won a lawsuit against Federal Express. So he's got one side. That brought a lot of joy to my heart. But he's been the attorney for the Onondaga Nation since 1982. He's a very excellent attorney. He works on the Onondaga Nation on behalf of the Clean Water Act and the pollution of Onondaga Lake and Onondaga Creek. So I would like to now give you Joe Heath.
My PowerPoint's a little different. It doesn't have outlines. It's sort of a mood-setting situation. First of all, I really want to express my appreciation.
Close to the mic. Yep, speak close.
Is that better?
Yes.
I want to start by expressing my appreciation to be able to come here today and to address you all. And
I'm not as good as Derek.
and to explain to you some of the consequences of Honeywell Allied Solvay process. That's the backward progression from now back in time that took a sacred lake. The Onondaga Lake is sacred to the Haudenosaunee and to the Onondaga Nation, and it is now the most polluted lake in the country. And Honeywell bears 90% of the responsibility for that. Actually, Allied bought Honeywell, but kept the Honeywell name because it's cleaner. They did, focus groups. But when we went to the corporate headquarters in 2005, the buildings still say Allied on it. And we'll come back to what they are doing as a corporation because they've become very slick at this. But let me start out with introducing the Onondaga Nation. And It is the central fire, or the capital, so to speak, of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. You probably know them as the Iroquois. The Iroquois is a pejorative term used by the French. Their name for themselves is the Haudenosaunee, which roughly translates into people living in a long house. They're also known as the Six Nation. This doesn't show up that well, but it does show some long houses. It's a traditional nation. It's very different than most of the Indian nations that you may hear about. There's no casino. They wouldn't have a casino. They could have it in 10 seconds because of the location near the city of Syracuse. But that would be a violation of their culture and religion. They are still governed by the same set of chiefs, or the same titled chiefs that the Creator gave them over 1,000 years ago, that the Peacemaker gave them over 1,000 years ago. Those chiefs are chosen by clan mothers. The clan mothers can also remove chiefs. And so it's the chiefs and the clan mothers and the faith keepers that work together to preserve the Onondaga Nation's sovereignty, culture, and jurisdiction. They're very opposed to gambling. And most of my work, I've been lucky enough to be general counsel for them since the early 80s. Most of my work these days is environmental in nature. It's more than we can possibly handle. We also do a great deal of archaeological protection. We just, about 3 weeks ago, we got 180 sets of ancestors remaining to return to the Onondaga Nation that were dug up in the 60s and held by the New York State Museum until we sued them.
Good.
So that's who the Onondaga Nation is. And I always start out my talks, if I can find it, with the way they began their land rights action. And it's the first paragraph of the land rights action. You might hear about land claims. The Onondaga Nation certainly have rights to lands that have been illegally taken by New York State, but they didn't file a claim to take the land back. They filed a land rights action to establish their rights to their Aboriginal homeland. We'll get into that a little bit more. This is their first paragraph, and unfortunately, it's a somewhat rough translation because in putting my files together, I didn't bring the, so I just wrote it here. But this is pretty close to word for word. The Onondaga Nation brings this action on behalf of its people to bring about a healing of all the people in this area, all the waters, and all the land. The nation has a unique historical, cultural, spiritual relationship with this land that goes far beyond state and federal concepts of ownership. The Onondaga people and its leaders have an obligation to be stewards of the land, to preserve it for all those generations yet to come. And so that's how they began their land rights action. So let me see if I can talk and chew gum at the same time. Geographically, obviously we're down here. This is Syracuse, New York. That's Onondaga Lake. These are watershed divides, these heavy lines. This is the beginning of the Susquehanna River Basin. I live right about there now, and the Tiafneoga River starts here, comes down in and feeds the Susquehanna. North, Onondaga Creek starts right here and flows north up through the Onondaga Nation, and we'll get a closer look at this, into Onondaga Lake, and then eventually up into Lake Ontario. So this is the area that we're talking about. This is a slide of the day we filed the land rights action. These are some of the clan mothers of the Onondaga Nation. And this is their Aboriginal territory. They had, before Europeans came here, this is the land that they hunted and fished throughout, had villages throughout. And all of these red labels are Superfund sites within their traditional Aboriginal territory. This is Onondaga Lake. I love this slide. This is what an engineer does. I often talk about the cultural disconnect between our approach to the environment, which is holistic and trying to look at all of it, and the engineers that we encounter daily. This is a slide made by Honeywell. and their engineers and the state DEC agree that somehow we can have water on this side of the lake that's not as clean as water up here. And I often give a talk called Speaking for the Heron, and I say, how does the heron know which side of the lake to fish on, to pull his fish out? But this is the city of Syracuse down here, so that it's a freshwater lake. The city, part of this is on the city, some of it's in other towns. This is the sewage plant. This is how we use the lake. Actually, and this is one of the largest malls in the country. Its current expansion has been slowed down. This is the area that we're going to talk about a great deal, because you'll see, remember this point here? This is the area that the Solvay Process Company started. And these labels, the Cement Tar Pit, the Willis Avenue plant, the Willis Avenue ball field site, we'll have another map that shows us more, but these are Allied legacies, and they're pretty horrible. This is Onondaga Creek, and we'll come back to that. This is Lake Creek. I don't know what I've done now.
Let me do it, yeah, go.
Lake Creek over here was a GM plant. GM pumped PCBs into that creek that still drained constantly into the lake. Up here is Bloody Brook. We're still trying to trace the history of that name, but up here was an old GE black and white picture tube. In the 60s, I grew up about 50 miles north of here in Oswego County, but GE had a huge picture tube factory up there, 40,000 workers. All of these industries are gone. There isn't one of those jobs left in central New York, of any of those industries that I just talked about. So that we're left without the jobs, but we're left with the environmental legacies. GE made, so mostly we have cadmium coming down Bloody Brook. There's a lot more to this, and we'll get back to it, but I just wanted to go over that somewhat brief explanation. And as I said, this is Onondaga Creek. Now there's the lake, that we were just looking at that. This is the creek. And it starts down here. This is that same watershed divide we saw before. We will come back to this a couple of times. But the creek starts here. This is a terminal moraine, a glacial wall of gravel that was pushed there by the glacier as it receded. There's a gravel company here. We'll talk about that very briefly. But the lake here is, the creek here is very, very clean. Trout. Solvay did salt mining right here. What they did was they took salt from here, from the Tully Valley, pumped it up here to Solvay, took limestone from what is now the largest open pit mine in the country, not 1 square inch of it reclaimed, combined the salt and the limestone to make soda ash. This started in the 1880s. It was a very early industrial process. For every pound of soda ash they made 1.5 pounds of water. So that's how it got started, and we'll come back to that more. So as I said, the lake is sacred to the Haudenosaunee and to the Onondaga, because their history teaches us that 1,000 years ago or so, actually there's an anthropology professor at Ithaca College that now dates the forming of the Confederacy in the year 909, but it's over 1,000 years. The peacemaker came among the then 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and had them bury their weapons of war underneath the Tree of Peace, and form the Confederacy that still exists today, and it is the blueprint for the democracy that we know today. This is the birthplace of democracy in North America. It's been recognized by Congress as that. These are symbolically the 4 roots of peace going out in all directions. This is a painting by Faith People on Lines that shows the same Tree of Peace with the eagle at the top looking out for trouble. So, on the shores of Onondaga Lake, the peacemaker brought the 5 warring nations together and formed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy under the Great Law of Peace. That's why the lake is sacred to them. And I try to get people to think back to what the land was like and the water was like prior to the European invasion. This is a painting of Mohawks returning to their longhouses along the Mohawk River. This is a French drawing in 1684. This, geographically, it's tilted. It ought to be on its side like this, but this is Lake Ontario. This is the Salmon River up in Oswego County. This is a drawing of an encounter between the French and an Onondaga village. This is probably 60 miles north of their currently recognized territory, but it shows that they were active throughout that Aboriginal territory. And it's very hard to get people to understand that because Europeans claimed that most of this land was empty. Well, when you break that down, that's really based on the doctrine of Christian discovery, which is something I hope you talk about. The doctrine of Christian discovery came about in 1493 when the Pope declared that Christian nations, when they traveled the world and found land unoccupied by Christians, that they had a right to the title of the land just by that discovery. And that the indigenous people that were living there became, at best, tenants with rights that could be ended at will by the discoverer. So this is showing that the land was not empty. This is a drawing that Champlain made in 1615, the first encounter between the Onondagas and, well, no, they made a treaty with the Dutch. The two-row wampum came about in 1613, a peace treaty. And we'll get back to the two-row because it's too important in their culture not to be part of this talk. This is a drawing that Champlain made. Champlain, most of us know, came down the St. Lawrence River, became very attached and worked very closely with the Algonquins and the Hurons, brought an army down in 1615 and attacked the Onondaga village. This is Onondaga Lake. This is Onondaga Creek before it was moved. This is Lake Creek before it was moved. This is where the Onondaga village was in 1615 when Champlain unsuccessfully attacked it, sieged it for days, and then had to withdraw. So their villages were on the lake. This is the two-row. This is the first treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Europeans. And it symbolizes two cultures traveling down the river of life together, never interfering with each other, respecting each other, sovereign, separate. We will travel the river of life together and not pass laws that affect each other. So that's a background to the kind of culture that the Onondagas and the Haudenosaunee talk about every day. There are Faith Keeper Online and Taradaho Sid Hill are north of here at Pace University today. The Taradaho will be using the two-row or a replica of the two-row to explain, it's another conference on water, to explain some of the same things that I'm talking about today. So that's a background. Now we're going to talk more about the lake. Before I get to this slide, once the Revolutionary War was over, Washington made three treaties with the Onondagas and the rest of the Haudenosaunee in 1784, 1789, 1794. The 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua recognized at least that portion of the Onondaga territory that's a mile around this lake, and then a 10-mile square box that goes about like that and comes back around here. So 10 miles to the south, which includes almost all of the city of Syracuse, and clearly all of this lake. It's preserved by a federal treaty. Well, it's not really protected by that federal treaty. Even though the United States government promised free use and enjoyment of this land, New York then knowingly kept buying the land from any individual Onondaga could throughout the 1790s and early 1800s. That's the legal basis of the land rights action. Knowingly violated federal law and took all of this land except for a very limited, currently recognized territory that we'll see on later maps. This map shows that in the 1890s, the lake was so clean, these are all water-based resorts that were on the lake. 1890. This is an old postcard of one of those resorts. This is that, oops, dangerous with this thing. This is that same water slide down into Onondaga Lake. This was a water-based resort industry around this same lake, just as Salve process was getting started. Another map of the lake. This is shows us everywhere that Salve process. Again, they took that salt from down here, the limestone from over here, set up a factory here, and made soda ash. And they had all this waste. So what are you going to do with it? Well, first they dumped it in the lake. They dumped so much of it in the lake that they filled the lake in 40%. All of that is still there. So that's an environmental legacy that's very difficult to even get recognized, and it has a tremendously negative impact on the ecosystem. Then finally, in the 1920s or so, the state said, well, you can't just dump it in the lake, you've got to do something else with it, dump it somewhere else. So this is where they dumped it, everywhere. All of these are former wetlands that they dumped their waste in. This is waste beds 1 through 8. You'll see more of this. This is waste beds 9 through 15. And we will come back to that. This is a 1938 aerial photograph of that same point that I asked you to remember. This is the state fairgrounds. This is that white waste that they dumped. Some of these piles of waste are as much as 80 feet high. This is what it looked like in 1938. This is one of my favorites. This is from 1943. What they did, this stuff is partially liquid. I would, the amount of water that was used in this process is probably staggering. So you have this liquid, semi-toxic waste that they put behind earthen dams and then pumped this waste into. Thanksgiving Day 1943, one of those dams broke and flooded the village of Salve, which is a working class town built up solely for this industry. So this is the kind of legacy of the Salve Process Company. This is one of the legacies that exists today. That's not sand. That's industrial waste on the shores of Onondaga Lake. The same area, better photograph actually. I just got my hands on this one. Nothing will grow in this. And so that slide that we saw before, 2,500 acres of land is ruined in this way. Not only is it, there we go. Not only is it bad up here, look at this stuff, breaking off, going into the lake where there's already other pollutions in the lake. So this is an example. Actually, I think there's a couple more. This is how it runs off. The lake's down here, you can see this boat that's pulled up to take this side. This is Salve process waste. You see what happens to vegetation when it grows here. Because it's highly, it has a basic, it has a pH problem, and so that when plants grow down more than about 2 feet, they end up dying. And so this is what's left on the edge of Onondaga Lake as a result of this industrial legacy. I think we got one more. This is an aerial view showing it's leaching constantly into the lake. This is a map that shows the Salve process allied chemical Honeywell industrial sites around the lake. So each of these is separate chemical facilities. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they began to develop other chemical uses for the byproducts of the solvay process soda ash production. This is the main plant. This is the LCP Bridge Street facility where they make chlorine using a mercury-based process or a process that produced mercury. So that from 1946 to 1970, every day Solvay dumped 2 pounds of mercury into the lake. Every day. And we'll come back to what that did because it's all still there. This site, the state of New York and the EPA says, well, that's cleaned up now because we got Solvay to clean up the first 7 feet down of the mercury. They've done a fairly good job at that. We created a wetland. What they haven't done is clean up the pool of free mercury that's 100 to 400 feet in the ground underneath there. 100 to 400 tons of mercury, 18 to 51 feet, sorry. But there's a huge amount of mercury just left in the ground, and both the DEC and the EPA say, okay, that's good enough, you can just walk away from that. What I didn't explain is that the lake itself is a Superfund site. The lake bottom, and we'll come back to that because it's a horrendous mess. And each of these sites that you see are Superfund sites. So that we have multiple Superfund sites, 10, and 10 more toxic sites that are not quite bad enough to make the Superfund list. So that's the kind of legacy that we have on this lake. Most of it, Allied's problem. This is an article from, I think it's 2005. And what it says, this is it documents that the level of mercury in the fish has increased 3 to 5 times in the last 5 years. Now, part of that's actually good news. And the good news is that the water is so much cleaner because that sewage plant that we saw just had to, it's run by the county, just had to implement $400 million of upgrades so that the sewage pollution to the lake has been significantly corrected. That allows the water to be much cleaner so the fish can go deeper and get more of the mercury that's in the sediment. In fact, one of the scientists says in this article, this shows our plan is working. Well, it doesn't mean that to the Onondagas. So the main problem that we have with Honeywell, with EPA, and with DEC is that rather than cleaning things up, they remediate. Now what remediation really means is that you leave it in place and you try to contain it. Or you leave 90% of it in place and try to contain it. And so you build barrier walls, you put caps. We had one site up on the other side of the lake, the Salina town dump, that was an active municipal dump until about 1970. The state, it's an unlined dump in a wetland next to Lake Creek. Not only did they take any waste that anybody would bring, totally unregulated, they took GM waste, which had PCBs in it, so that we now have PCBs leaching out of the wetland into Lake Creek, into the lake. And so in the 80s, the DEC said, well, we'll have you put a cap on that, 2-foot dirt cap. This is a wetland. You put a 2-foot dirt cap on it. They said that was good enough, signed it off. And now they have to come back and put a really good cap on it and a barrier wall and a pump and treat. This slide shows that, and so we have all these toxic sites over here that are still leaching most of the toxic. This is 690, an interstate that runs on this side of the lake. This map indicates a barrier wall that they have just completed building. So they can't keep the chemicals from leaching here because they won't clean them up over here. So this is a barrier wall, a steel barrier wall, 50 feet here, 100 feet here, almost a half a mile here, filling in another 6.5 million gallons of the lake. And this is their idea of cleaning up. It's not the Onondaga's idea of cleaning up.